All right. Good morning, everyone. It's just after 1 p.m. here in Toronto, 11 o'clock out on the West Coast. Really excited to be welcoming you back to another Foresight Fireside Chat, the first one of 2022. Very important topic today on corporate governance. And we're really excited to be welcoming another fantastic lineup of speakers today. We have Michael Robinson joining us from the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. He's written and lectured extensively on the topic of corporate governance, so we're happy to have him here. We also have David Edmonds joining us as well. David is the chairman of a company called the A100. You may have heard of it. They support entrepreneurs in the Alberta startup ecosystem through advisory and capital. As a successful entrepreneur himself, he is an expert in corporate governance, and we're also excited to have him here today. We also just figuring out things on our end. We're also going to be having Shannon Costner joining us today as well as the moderator of the conversation. I think we're just having a couple technical issues. Shannon is one of the EIRs with Foresight, as some of you might know, but she also holds the role of CFO in a number of organizations. So she lives and breathes in the world of corporate governance. And so we're really excited to have her on the call today as well. Just before I pass things off for a little bit more elaborate introductions, I just want to remind everyone that this is a conversation, and we're really looking forward to all the questions that you have. Please put them in the Q&A box. You can kind of see it on the bottom. There's a little menu bar at the bottom of the screen there. It's on the right-hand side. Please put it in there. It helps us answer the questions a little bit more diligently. The chat does work, but like I said, it's more helpful to have it in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Michael and Dave to do their introductions, and we'll get set up from there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tyler, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and as you'll see, I've got a few insights I hope to be able to pass along to you as we go forward today. But as Tyler said, it is a conversation, so we're not going to talk for a full hour. We're going to leave lots of time for your questions, and we look forward to hearing from you. I'm a professor of entrepreneurial finance in the Haskayne School at the University of Calgary. I've been there for 30 some odd years, but that doesn't mean I don't understand a little bit about your world, if you will. And my whole interest in corporate governance happened a bit early in my career when I'd made a few angel investments, and I found out I was pretty bad at it, actually. I found out I was spectacularly unsuccessful as an angel investor. And there's some reasons for that. We'll highlight those as we go forward here. But as a result of that, I thought, if I want to kind of understand a little bit more about this, maybe I should go back to school. In this case, going back to school meant taking a leave of absence from the university and working in the venture capital industry. So I worked for the BDC's venture capital division here in Calgary for a period of time. And that's when I really started to learn about governance and the importance of governance, because investors have a different perspective on governance. And hopefully we have a sense of that in the discussion here today. So I learned from that experience. Then I was offered the opportunity to become the academic director of our director's education program. So I started to get more formal in my training on governance. That was back 2004. Recently, I was asked to be the first site lead for the CDL Rockies program. So I've had an opportunity to observe ventures such as yourselves coming through the program and understand some of what's going on in your world. I actually am just working on a research paper that analyzes what goes on in the CDL Rockies program. And I found that if you are, as an entrepreneur, as a founder, focusing on developing your governance structure, getting your financing figured out, in conjunction with developing your product market fit, you're more likely to attract mentor support, because that's what your mentors and potential investors are looking for. That governance is critically important. And this is even at the seed and the pre-seed stage of financing. So I'm going to pause there. I think I've got some things I can share with you today, and I look forward to the conversation. So Dave, over to you.
Sure. Hi, as Tyler mentioned, I'm Dave Edmonds. I'm the industry chairman of the A100. It's a not-for-profit member-funded organization here in Alberta, and it's really dedicated to help drive lasting diversification in Alberta's economy. And we were formed in 2010. There's over 110 members made up of primarily experienced entrepreneurs who've started, grown, and sold their companies. And as time has gone by, we have a number of what I'll call portfolio activities within that. One is Accelerate AB, which is a big conference and roundtable session we host with early stage entrepreneurs. And then in June, we launched the new Start Alberta platform, which is a real-time data program portal, I guess is a better term to use, that tracks all 2,400 tech startups in Alberta. We've got over 200 investors on it. And is a really great site, and we're tied into the European Union ecosystems through that. And I know Montreal is looking to get on the platform as well. So anyway, and I started a number of tech companies, and I'm fine. The last item is I'm an investment partner in Accelerate Fund here in Alberta, which is an angel matching fund where we invest only in Alberta-based companies. We've got over 30 companies in the portfolio, and we'll be adding 3 more by the first part of February. So $23 million fund right now. And unlike Michael, I suffered on a lot of boards through some of the things that were here, and we'll see if we can share some of the horror stories that didn't have to be. And I see Shannon's on now, so I'll turn it over to Shannon.
Hi, everyone can hear me now. Thanks for the delay and the patience with the technical matter. This is a really exciting topic and very important for boards or companies that are starting to have boards. I'm really excited to be here. My background is largely been in the small tech community here in BC. I've spent most of my career in purpose-driven organizations such as life science or clean tech. And in 2019, I was fortunate and luck is part of it, lucky to be part of one of a very large and very complicated exit when Generac purchased the company that I was with, Nurio. During that time, I have also been very interactive with boards. And so there's a lot of learnings at these early stage companies as to bringing on boards and sort of the role that the board plays with the growth and evolution of the company. And like Michael, I also hold my ICD, and so have the opportunity to look at the board from inside an organization and helping the organization get ready and prepared for healthy interaction with an external facing board. So that's my background. So my role today is to moderate the discussion related to governance and early stage companies. So with that, now that we've all introduced ourselves, why don't we start off with a very high level summary of the role of the board, the difference between a board and an advisory board, just sort of some meat and potatoes of really what a board is. And I'll just throw that question out there to Michael, and he can provide like a high level summary of really what a role of the board is.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. It's an evolutionary process as a corporation develops. So if we start off, we think about the various levels of decision making that exist in a corporation. And when you're the founder, you're the predominant shareholder, you are your team, you're the management team, and you're also your board. So you've kind of got 3 different hats that you're wearing in the room when you're trying to discharge your responsibilities. And it's useful to kind of unpack those, because over time, what's going to happen is you're going to evolve towards a more corporate board structure. And it's useful to understand what does the board do versus what does management do versus what do shareholders do. Yeah. And so a couple of things. First off, this issue of an advisory board versus a governance board, there's a simple answer to that. If you're a CEO and you set up an advisory board, they work for you and provide you the guidance and insights that you require. If you're a CEO and you set up a governance board, you work for them because you've got a fiduciary, they have a fiduciary duty to the corporation, which is a broad notion, and that's a whole different discussion, but something we might get into. Whereas advisors don't have that fiduciary duty. So as a director, someone that undertakes that responsibility has to think about the fullness of the organization that they're dealing with, and that looks at the shareholders, the bondholders, if there are any, the employees, the community. It's a broad issue about what you have to do. But now let's drill down. The key way that the board discharges its responsibilities is to help management frame up strategy. I mean, that's the first and foremost aspect of the responsibilities of a board. And so guidance that I provide to founders, CEOs trying to build a board is to think about very carefully, what is the value add that particular individual is that you're considering adding to your board? Like, can they help you answer those tough questions that you have? Understanding, the nature of the competitive landscape, help open doors to potential customers, the things that you really need assistance with as you go to build your business. So job one of the board really is get strategy right. The flip side of that is the risk management piece, like strategy and opportunity and the risks associated with the two go hand in hand. So the board has this role to play in terms of establishing kind of the risk tolerance, if you will, for the corporation. So, and again, go ahead, anytime.
I was just saying, so when you sort of define those two roles for an advisory board, which might be more technically orientated around the technology or industry specific because they're specialists in that area, and then you have the other board, the oversight for the company, then how do you go about sort of determining when to have an advisory board or not? Because some organizations have them and some don't. So that's one question I'll throw out there. And then I'll throw this question out to Dave, is then what specifically, how do you go about slating a board or determining who is on the board, whether it's the governance board or the advisory board? And maybe we'll start with Michael and then we'll go to David.
Well, just picking up on your quick question about when do you want an advisory board? Probably, as soon as possible. And you don't have to call it a board. Advisors are valuable people in the whole process. They don't have to meet as a full board, although that's a useful thing to do maybe on a semi-annual basis. But one of the things I did find in my study of the CDL Rockies program is entering the program, if you already have an advisor lined up, you're more likely to get mentor support. So I think that's either an indication. Let's back up a minute. There's this whole dating process that goes on between advisors and the corporation and potential investors, and there's a matching and a fit issue there. And so one of the things that investors do, they're very pressed for time. They look for signals. And so the signal that you're willing to be coachable is an important signal. And so if you've already identified high quality advisors, that's a strong signal that you're somebody that is willing to listen to guidance. So I would suggest, as you develop, you think about, I need some help over here. Who could help me over here? But be careful about that as well. And I'll let Dave talk about that being careful bit. I mean, you don't want to just say, okay, here's a whole bunch of shares, help me out here. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I think Michael hit the nail on the head. Is, the dating metaphor is, as a founder, you're going to be in the public realm. You're going to drink more coffee or tea or any other fluid you've ever thought possible, because you have to have a broad network, not just for money, but for advice. And there really has to be a symbiotic relationship formed. And I kind of point to advisors. The advisor that you have today is likely not going to be the advisor you have a year and a half from now, because the challenges that you face are going to change over time. So my preposition on this is, you're going to meet as many people as you can, and you're going to start to understand, as will that person you're meeting with, if there's going to be a match emotionally, morally, all these other aspects that are key for trusted relationships.
So when you know that the company is going to involve as well as the boards and advisors, so do you go into these conversations when you're trying to slate a board, leading with that sort of idea and say, look, we're going to try this out in terms of a fixed term, and say, we're looking at a 2-year term in order to sort of put an end to that and then reassess it? Or do you just keep them on until who signals that it's no longer?
Yeah, I think it's a natural progression is, if I'm using Michael as an advisor, is the space between those conversations, stretch out, because, the things that he's given me, I should be acting on. I'm not saying not every piece of advice is an action item for the entrepreneur, because what I really like is I might give some advice and the entrepreneur comes back and says, I've evaluated that, but I think this approach is better for me. What do you think?
Yes.
Or, that's the way we're going to go. I think where you get into danger is an advisor believes he's directing you rather than advising. And that's where the danger signals, I need to get some money, I need to get some shares, because advisory is early relationships. If you formalize an advisor group, one of the big questions that comes up quite a bit is it always on an individual basis, or is it as a group of advisors? Because then you've got group dynamics as well.
Yeah, and so that brings up two comments that I can think about that. So when you talk about a group and the notion of sort of slating a board or advisors, maybe you can touch on the point of board culture or awareness. Even at early stages, it's an interesting topic to try and have differences at the board to create enough meaningful conversations. And then the other topic that I want to that you started to touch on is when you're a shareholder, like, what about conflict of interest and how that plays? Because sometimes your shareholders that start out are in fact then turned to be a board. So, Michael, do you want to maybe touch on sort of the culture aspect of within a board and the importance and the role of that?
Yeah, and you've highlighted an important item. I mentioned there's this evolutionary process in a board, and I'm writing a book on this topic, and I sort of break it into 3 main types of governance structures. You've got kind of the founder-controlled governance structure, where you've got the same individuals wearing the 3 hats, and the risk profile and the things that you have to worry about are different. Then when you move into kind of a shared governance model, where you've got some investors, typically venture capitalists, or maybe some angels that have asked for and been granted a board seat as part of the financing round that goes forward. And then you've got inherent conflict around that table in a whole bunch of different ways. So for example, the form of the security. Typically, if you've got, a venture capitalist, they're going to want preferred shares with all kinds of rights and privileges, because from their perspective, governance is broader than just the corporate governance. From their perspective, they're worried about protecting their investment. So they're going to engage in 3 main activities to help control the investment situation. They'll do extensive due diligence. They'll do a heck of a lot of contracting as part of the negotiation process. Then they'll do the ongoing monitoring. So it's important to have a sense of those potential conflicts around the board table, and they're numerous. And then the culture piece, critically important aspect that isn't discussed enough is who's the chair of the board, and who should be the chair of the board. A lot of times the founder goes, I want to be the CEO and the chair because I want to be in charge of everything. And I would caution you against that, because one key aspect of a board is to provide oversight and guidance, and potentially have to discipline or remove or replace the CEO, and you want an independent person to have that responsibility of running the board. And so I think you want to be very careful about who that chair is, because they're the one that really helps set that culture, what's the tone of the conversation around the table, and all those aspects of having an open, full discussion. And there are some guidances out there. And as we go forward, I can maybe share some insights. There's some chat information I can share. For example, Sean Abbott has thought about this a lot from Inovia Capital, and he's got some guidance to boards. It's useful to sit down in a meeting and say, what are we going to do as a board? And it's certainly useful for a founder to think about, what do I want from my board as they go forward to try and set it up? Like, what support do I need? how much control, if you will, am I willing to give to my board, because they've got to have this oversight responsibility. And if you're not willing to give them the chance to oversee you, then that's not going to work out very well. So there is a dance that goes on here that you have to be very cognizant of as you move forward. But I'll pause and let Dave. I know he's got a lot to add to this commentary as well.
Yeah, I think even in the chat, conflict of interest, so everybody seems to gloss over that is, and I think it goes back to one of Michael's points. The number, advisors are helping the founder. The board's sole focus is the survivability of the company, right? Which most people don't understand. This, founders will say, well, you're representing the shareholders, you're representing me. Is no, as soon as I sign on the dotted line, or Michael or any of us, is that view changes. We're here about the survivability of the company. And so back to the conflict of interest, if I look at my role over different organizations, in the early days, I spend a lot of time on conflict of interest and just conflict between founders in particular. And I see one of the questions is there. And that's where your advisors in some cases morph into your board and end up as the chairman, right? If there's somebody that's living with the company through that progression. I think, the question as a founder that I always asked is what I'm doing right for the company? Is it right for the shareholders? Is it right for the employees? And is it right for me? I'm down at the bottom of the list.
Yeah.
Because if you have a board that's made up of all the founders, to use a unsavory term, you're all sucking your own gas. You need somebody to challenge you on your assumptions and thinking.
So you bring up a good a point about not only slating a board, but at what time does early stage companies bring in that independent voice, that total independent director? Because often there's the board can be made up of shareholders or people that are too close to them. Hey, but when do they truly sort of seek out that independent voice to sort of balance that thought? Does it happen in early stage companies? What do you see?
Yeah, I think, back to the morphing from an advisor into that role. And in the early days, and I say Henry Katarna's on here, don't mean to call him out, but one of the things that, that we always saw was early stage founders either picking a finance person or a lawyer as their first piece. And that's structurally good as a secretary and to help you, to ensure. But I think if I started a company today and I knew what I was going to do and it was in this space, the very first thing I start looking for are the thought leaders. Because unfortunately, we Canadians think too provincially and too nationally is, we're not global experts on everything. And that's a whole part of the path that you take. So I think you need a local resource. So like when I was an early investor in Clio, Point 9 was an investor and they reached out and said, we want you to invest, but we want somebody local to be part of the advisory and the board. Yeah. So those are a lot of the thinking, that the founders got to do.
So you bring up a good point with certain dynamics, and that could possibly bring in geographical sort of board members. So early stage companies, it's not uncommon for them to have inbound investments from a US-based VC. And so really, what does the dynamics and difference mean when you have a US-based VC who's now on your board versus complete Canadian domestic-based board members? The oversight is, and the lens of it is slightly different, but I'll let you sort of address that.
I'll just be really quick because I know Michael's got more background than I do. But, one of the best things that we've seen is we are getting investors from Europe and from Asia and beyond is with the Americans. I'm on a board right now that's primarily Americans. And some dramatic differences are HR laws, right? They're always astounded. What do you mean you can't get rid of everybody with a week's notice when we have to pay them? And so, trying to follow global standards. So the CBCA has a set of documents that they use, that they put up, post them free. And then in the US, there's an equivalent of that. And those two documents are very similar. Yeah. But if I look at anything, the biggest issue for boards with US members is HR and payment to the board members. Like, they do their stock structure so differently as they go, what do you mean I'm not getting like 100,000 shares and all these other things?
Totally. We'll get into the pitch of advisors and board members in a minute, but maybe Michael, you could address sort of the oversight that US companies have for their boards versus Canadian companies, sort of the different tone there, and how that needs to be just taken into consideration.
Yeah, certainly a lot of people don't understand our corporate laws are different. So in Canada, as I've mentioned, the board and the directors have a fiduciary duty to the corporation, that broad entity that we've talked about here. In the US, it's quite a bit different. Their fiduciary duty is to the shareholders. And as a result, there are actions they might think are reasonable to take because they act in the best interest of the shareholders. And Dave alluded to one in terms of, how you have to deal with your employees, for example, that they are a key element of the corporation. So a board in Canada has to take that into account. So, those are some pretty fundamental discussions you have to have around that board table in terms of what are we here for? Who do we act on behalf of? And there's an education piece has to be done for some of these US VCs that come up and say, okay, well, here's how things are going to run. You go, well, no, we can't do it that way because we've got different laws.
Yeah.
I'll back it up to just, again, going back to the idea of you as a founder trying to attract directors and everything. Think about the three key things we say directors should provide to a board, to a management team. We've talked about the oversight piece, and that's critically important. But if you just have directors, for example, with public board experience, they're going to come in and say, okay, here's what we need. Here's the reporting we need. We need quarterly updates on this and this and this. They don't have a sense of the journey that you're on. So there's an empathy piece. And I've been doing interviews with people that spend a lot of time in board contexts. And you really have to find directors that understand the journey that the CEO and the team is on. So oversight, yes. But there's a foresight piece, which is to help you understand, provide guidance to the CEO and also insight. So, it's a forward-looking thing. Don't think of your directors as kind of gatekeepers that are just there to keep an eye on you and make sure that everything's done properly. They're there to be a resource. And when you're building your board, be very thoughtful about what is the resource I need. And Dave identified this earlier. It's going to modify as you grow. So, don't be shy about pushing back.
So you have a really good point that when companies are smaller and they still have a board, board members can themselves play a different role. They're kind of, in some ways, kind of rolling up their sleeves a little bit more and leading in more. And then sometimes they're the advisor to the CEO, and other times they're purely have their board hat. How is it that board members, as well as the CEOs and founders, should know when they're switching out of those different conversations and sort of the overall communication within the CEO, founder, and the board? Because sometimes they're acting as an advisor and sometimes they're acting as a board member. So how does that hat switch happen for both sides? Maybe, I'll throw it out to David, and Michael, you can jump in as well.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I'm a really big believer in is, to me, coach, mentor, and again, that depends on whether it's an action item or not, is really important for the CEO. The CEO founder needs to have somebody he can talk to when he's got things he can't tell his wife or his partner. He can't tell his
husband.
Or his husband, right? And that they can share, they can't share with their employees, can't share with their board of directors, is they need a vent. And that's where a lot of the mental health issues come in, is they feel that they're isolated. So I put those over on the right column, and that's about the founder. The advisors, as you say, and the board. A good board does roll up its sleeves. One of the boards I'm on is very, would be super powerful board. I'm not counting myself, for a smaller company that's in the $10 million range. But, the compensation committee and audit committee are the only two committees right now. And that's where a ton of work was done by the board to make it easier for the CEO and the rest of the employees to focus on scaling.
Yeah.
So,
Michael, is there anything in terms of additional documentation or anything that needs to happen when the board is having these, different types of conversations, so that nobody's caught off guard or surprised, and then all of a sudden saying, hey, I'm talking to you as that advice I gave you was as a mentor or a coach. It wasn't as a board member. So how do you make sure that those communications are sort of clear or documented within the whole board? Like, what signals do you bring over to the board as a whole?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. What hat are you wearing and when you're wearing it? An analogy was when I worked for the BDC, I was told when I went into the board meeting, I had to take off my investor hat and put on my director hat. Yeah. So you want to know in what meeting you are. And when you're in the board meeting, everybody's the same. You're not a mentor, you're not a coach, you're there as a director, acting collaboratively to try and create value in the corporation. That's your job, full stop. So a lot of these mentoring, rolling your sleeves up aspects take place outside of the formal board context. They're done, chats in the evening or, a one-on-one meeting or what have you. So they're not, I wouldn't put them in the formal board context per se. So you don't want to document those because they're really not, I'm going to get a little legal here. They're not discoverable. Board conversations and board actions are potentially discoverable in litigation. So you want to be careful about that. And I'm going to just roll back to your question. To avoid getting in trouble at a board level, you want to be very thoughtful about your decision-making process. Yeah. So where you get in trouble as a board or as an individual director is not necessarily if your decision is wrong. It's if you didn't make it in the right way.
Right.
So when you're called to task, potentially for a decision, the courts aren't going to say, that decision didn't work out, so it was the wrong decision. They're going to say, what was the information you used? How much time did you take? What was the process you engaged in to make that decision as a board? Yeah. And if you're checking the boxes and doing everything appropriately through it, you're fine. You're not expected to be superhuman. If you look at the responsibilities of a director, the criteria to be a director, there's no special education required to be a director. There's no expectation you have superhuman capabilities.
And for me, myself, as a CFO, working alongside founders and CEOs, I actually signal to the CEO, because I feel like I have some reasonable amount of board experience. I signal to the CEO and I ask the CEO and say, can I talk to the board about X? It is not my job to go directly to the board. That's kind of a no-no. And so, for example, when I'm in audit season and I'm about to embark on the audit, I signal to the CEO and say, is it okay that I can have the next month to talk strictly about the audit in terms of scheduling and matters of the audit committee to the audit committee chair? And so I find even an etiquette of appropriate communication from even early stage companies with the interaction of a board. I think it's, for me personally, really inappropriate for me to, even though I sit on the board as a corporate secretary, that's one hat I wear, but I wear the hat as a CFO. I signal to the CEO and to the chair to let them know that I'm having a conversation. So in no way is it bucketed as a side conversation within the context of like a separate committee within the overreaching my sort of communication with the audit committee chair or something like that. So I think it's really important, even from an early stage, that founders and CEOs get used to the different signals of the support, whether it's mentor, coaching, or a board that's leading in a little bit more on operations, as well as the formal board role. Now,
I was just, if I could just add to that, that goes both ways. It's an interesting point. Is, you know, the board I mentioned where we were really focused on building the compensation model. Every time we spoke to the CFO or the head of sales, or, you know, we talked to a lot of the employees, we let the CEO know.
yes,
that we had established that we didn't want him on those calls.
yes,
And, you know, that was the first step. Just so you know, if we're going to do this, we need independence.
yes.
So I think you raised a really good point.
Yeah.
That's got to go both ways.
It does. So yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So one of the topics that came up earlier that we haven't addressed is when an early stage company has board members and advisory board members, they're often strapped for cash or don't have the long runway time, and you know, lots of hard work for board members as well, trying to get these companies to the next stage and level. How is it appropriate to compensate board members as well as advisory members for early stage companies? You know, what is the tone out there? You know, what are the signals that are, or ranges that are used in terms of trying to get them there? And I'll throw this out to Michael first, and then David can chime in on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. As you've indicated, you want some really high capable, high performing people to be part of your advisory, part of your board. And so they expect compensation. I mean, most people, Dave and others in the community are very altruistic. They want to help build. You've heard all this discussion about the A100 and the great initiatives they're engaged in. But at some point they go, look, I've got so many hours in the day. And at some point in time, it gets beyond altruism and it gets into, you know, you're eating into my time when I could be doing other things I like to do. So compensate, you have to think about that. You can't just expect, you know, this to be a free good forever as you go forward. You know, early on, yeah, it's okay. But then you want to formalize the relationship. Going back to the dating analogy, you start to go steady, if you will, or what have you. And so I believe you've had a conversation earlier in this sort of series of discussions around ESOPs and that idea that you set aside a chunk of capital, you know, to share capital in terms of options for the employees. Well, you use that pool as well to compensate your advisors and your directors. So advisors, you know, there's different numbers depending on the skill that they bring and the time commitment and all that kind of stuff, anywhere from maybe 1/4 to 0.5% of the equity over sort of a 3-year time period. And just to make sure that the relationship is working, you put maybe a 6-month cliff on that. So they've got to be there for at least 6 months to get some of that. So there's those aspects of it all. Directors, because they've got a fiduciary duty, they've got a lot more liability walking in that door. And so as a result, then you have to compensate them appropriately. So I don't know the numbers. I heard 1.5 around that number of the equity at that point in time, maybe with a 3-year vesting period. And that's going back to your earlier question about, you know, when do you have a migration off of the board? You know, you kind of say, okay, this is for the next 3 years, and then we're going to reassess. And, you know, if it's not working or you don't need that skill set anymore, you go, okay, well, that's fine. We're not going to give you any more shares from the next 3 years. So that's kind of a strong signal that person isn't going to be there going forward.
Yeah, yeah. And those are the kind of the ranges that I generally hear, is that a board member can be up to 1% or slightly higher than that. And if you're a board chair or an audit committee chair, you get just a slight bit more for the extra oversight and extra time. And that's generally, if you look on you know, other boards that have publicly available information, usually the chair, the audit committee chair, or the compensation chair, they tend to get a slight extra little bit about that. But Dave, do you want to weigh in on that? And then how do you deal with the same way with advisors versus board members? Like, how do you approach that as well? Because the board members have like all this responsibility and advisors do not. So are they entitled to the same level of
Well, it goes back to bucketing again, right? If it's, coffee time, right? No money. As Michael points out, is, that's what many people in the community will do for a point problem resolution. If it looks like you're going to have an advisor who's actually going to provide value over a period of time is when you start to do that. But I think go back to what Michael brought up with the option plan. You clearly have to have a plan that includes advisors, board members, and so on. But those numbers are pretty bang on to what we see. The challenge becomes sometimes when you have a real technical issue and you need somebody you could never afford that is out of kind of the context of that. Like, in a deal that we were involved in years ago, one of the first people that was using nanoparticle technology in the energy industry was out of Saudi Arabia. And he said, yeah, I know you don't have any money, but I want, and he just picked a number and he didn't understand the context. So you've still got to segment who those people are. But I agree with Michael, on board members, it's a 3x3, right? They're vested over 3 or 3x5. But the one thing that in the planning stage that most people don't think about is I really like a yearly self-assessment of the board, right? Because that's a parachute before the 3-year period or before the next vote is you do those self-assessments, and it really solves a lot of problems because then you have your other board members rating each other and themselves.
Right, and self-assessments annually also signal to sort of the next layering of the board.
Yeah.
Of, we're handling this really well, we're doing this really well, but we're not over here yet. And it could be that there could be a deficit of skill on the board, or the board is looking to reach farther into that area. So that becomes sort of a criteria that they're looking for, either from a culture point of view or a skill set point of view from a board. So these are all like, slating a board, the differences between a board, so compensating a board. I can't underscore enough the importance of having a well thought out, well planned option sort of path or trajectory for the company overall. And what that has to include is it has to include board and advisors, not just employees. And you'll miss out on if you don't include that in your careful planning. And I'll add one more thing here is as you consider potential board members that are outside of the jurisdiction of Canada, options are another can of worms, if you will, for options for people domiciled in the US or options for people domiciled in another jurisdiction. So as you grow and evolve, it's really important that you get the right advice from an option, a tax, a liability point of view, whether it's foreign employees or foreign-based employees, foreign-based consultants, or foreign-based board members, or foreign-based advisory board members. It's just another layer of things to consider. And you may have a resident expert in the States that's crucial to sort of the area that you're in, but you need to make sure you're well informed and well advised as to what options might look like for that person. So at this point, we're starting to get some questions in the question and answer thing. So what I'm going to do is we're going to open it up and address those. So for those of you that have some questions or topic item that we haven't addressed or something very specific, I'd encourage you now to sort of put that in there. And I'm going to start going through some of these questions and answers, and we'll address them here in this. So one of them deals with this very topic about compensation. So it says, somebody hears a lot from startups and CEO startups that they're getting outrageous demands from potential advisors and board members for compensations. And how do you have a script for them to sort of have this discussion? So this is interesting. You do have people in the community that are like Dave and Michael that are really spirited in the right direction about mentoring and guiding and getting everybody to the next level. And then you have people that you know, are very aggressive with compensation and that. How do you deal with that, Dave? How is it that a young stage early CEO deals with that? What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I treat that similar, in a similar vein as, are you for sale, right? Are you for sale? I'm focused on building a world-class organization that should draw the interest of many people. And, you know, we expect to have conversations. And I think preparing, you know, for the one about exorbitant money, we have a plan in place that we can afford as an early stage company to compensate people that help us to believe in the vision that we do. And we know that it's not going to meet some of your requirements that way. But we need committed people the way we are, right? You know,
Yeah.
just again, you have a plan, you have a capacity, and you're looking for people that want to be on the journey with you.
And the other comment for when you're putting, when people make those demands on you, those options have to go in front of the board to be approved. And so even all the other board members that are sitting there will go, well, why is that person getting so much more? Why? So I do support what you're saying, that you have to lead the sort of direction and tone that this is sort of the compensation that we have, and things can change in the future, but this is where we're at. Are you sort of on board or not? So I'm just gonna, Michael, do you have anything else to add into that? I'm just gonna go to some other questions here.
No, I think that was well answered. My only other perspective would be, okay, well, if you want that, what value can you bring? Like if there's a superstar that will open up a door to the CEO of a potential customer, you go, okay, that makes sense, but then you got to prove it, right? So, you know, somehow, you know, they'll be vested, and, you know, if this doesn't happen, you step off the board. It gets too complicated, but, you know, you want to push back and say, what is it that you can add to my business that's going to make you that valuable versus everybody else I could look at?
Yeah, I gave some advice in another program that I was involved with Foresight, where a CEO and founder was splitting up sort of the company to bring on more founders. And I think it parallels what's kind of going on here. Test the relationship, start out simple. Things can always evolve and change down the road. More compensation options can be provided to board members as things are successful for both sides. But if you open up that Pandora's box and allow a greater amount up front and then realize, oh shit, that wasn't the best, you can't pull back. So start out with, very much like Michael said, with the dating concept, and start there. And then you can always evolve and add things there. So another question on the table here is, you discover an independent board member and a CEO, and the board member are engaged in a, what is it? A romantic relationship. So you have a potential conflict, and it doesn't even have to be a relationship. Let's frame it so that they're, you know, good buddies, or, you know, have a long personal relationship, whether it's romantic or not, between an independent board member and the CEO. Wow, this has happened before in very public forums, as well as other companies. Michael, what do you say to that?
Well, first, they're not independent, obviously. I mean, what you want, there's technical independence, which means they're not a former employee or current employee and all that kind of stuff. But there's the independence of thought and independence of mind. And that person's just not going to be independent. So that's where, if you have a strong chair and they get this piece of information, it's up to them to have a chat with both parties and say, look, this is going to complicate the functioning of the board. It's going to be a distraction to the board. How are we going to resolve this? And usually the best resolution, unless that director is adding significant value, is for that director not to be there anymore.
That's right. Yeah. I think it's a pretty great, reasonable response to that. Another question here is a serious problem falls short with angering and losing customers. So you have a board or CEO who has become a serious problem. And so there's issues with customers and fiduciary responsibility. So let's say you have an first-time CEO that's struggling in various forms. You know, how does the board essentially deal with that? And I think we alluded to it earlier, but maybe we'll just sort of frame it up real quick here. So Dave, what do you do when the board starts to realize that?
I think in particular, like with COVID, you know, I think when COVID hit, we in the portfolio spent a lot of time on mental health issues. Is as a board, the first thing we did was try to dig into what the underlying issue was. Like, was there something that we could help that person with? But as we talked about in the preamble to this, is my job is the survivability of the company.
Yes.
And so, you know, if you go through a process and a mediation trying to figure out what's in below this, and it's just a person that, well, number one, when I read that, the person was probably uncoachable to begin with, right? So I personally wouldn't be on the board, but there comes a time and it becomes more complex because depending on how early that person might own the majority of the company.
Yeah.
You know, so what he's at risk at is all the board and employees leaving, right? Because that's how companies collapse, is they're so internalized they can never execute externally.
I always advise and recommend, and there's an awesome book out there called The Founder's Dilemma, and it has a lot of amazing companies, early stage tussles either between founders or founders and board. And really it boils down to a conversation of the founder, like, are you focused around fundamentally money, like a success, or focused around ego where you need to stay in a position of CEO or what have you, or both? And you need to sort of determine where your path is, so that when these tough conversations and questions come up, do you want to be a successful shareholder, or do you want to be a successful CEO? And so they're very different, but making sure you're open and honest with yourself as to what those questions, you know, where you stand. And you know, you'll be able to sort of have, when things come up and the board says, hey, I'm not sure we're going to get to the next stage with you as CEO. Then you step aside and you remain as a successful shareholder, hopefully a successful shareholder, but somebody else takes over sort of the reins of the company. And this happens a lot more than people think. But yeah, Michael, did you want to weigh in on that quickly?
Yeah, no, a couple of examples from the CDL Rockies program have been successful transitions. And, you know, at some point in time, you know, I think as you've indicated, you know, if you're a founder and the corporation outgrows you, that is success. Don't look on that as failure. Look on that as horrendous, a huge success. Yeah. You've built something bigger than what your skill set is at that point in time, and have the wherewithal, the personal insight to realize that maybe you're not the right person. Now, this is where you need the relationship between the CEO and chair is critically important in any board context. And this is where the board chair starts to, you know, send signals to the CEO. Usually after every board meeting, there should be a one-on-one conversation between the CEO and the board chair. You know, here's what we're seeing. Here's how the directors, you have in-camera sessions within the board context as well, where the directors start to talk about these things. And they then surface these issues, which the chair takes back to the CEO. So those are important things to be aware of. And so it's also that, you know, as a board, you set objectives for the CEO. Like, you know, you're there to oversee, but you also say, here's what the plan is for the next 6 months or year, whatever. Yeah. Go execute. And then if, you know, things are not aligned, and execution could mean like relationships with customers. It's not always sales measures. It's, how are you building the organization? How are you maintaining relationships and those sorts of things? So, that's part of the board's job, is to assess the CEO's performance against those objectives that have been agreed upon ahead of time by all parties. And then you go, okay, fine, there's a disconnect here. And Dave said, let's dig down. This is a skilled person. We put them in charge because they're a skilled person. There could be some work that we could do to help them get back up to where they could really be high functioning. But it's a tough job being a director. You got to do all those things.
It's tough. And I find some CEO founders handle the transition well, and others it's just a lot of humility to kind of get through. So I've just a couple more, one or two quick more questions here before we wrap it up. Comments came up on board observers. Do you have board observers at this stage?
Well, I'm for Accelerate Fund, which is really an early stage fund, right? We prefer just an observer status, right? Because we know, we have value as a shareholder, we have value through our experience set, but, we can't be on 32 boards. So we do that quite often, even the 6 companies that are done Series A, we're still observers. And we ask, like when we did this last $12 million US financing, we said to the incoming VCs, right, do you want us to continue as observers? And they said, yeah, because you're direct advisors locally to the CEO. So the answer to that one is yes.
Yeah, and observers have time limits as well. In my prior board at Nurio, the CEO and founder had an exit, like leaving the company, and the board was fired at the same time, and I came in between those two events to help sort of evolve the company to the next level before they were taken out in acquisition. But we had one prior board member from the terminated board sit as an observer on sort of like a transition to the new board, and it was only set for a 1-year term, just to help bring history and stuff of that nature. So they do have a purpose. Well, we're just at the top of the hour here. This is an enormous topic that I'm sure we could talk about in many different areas and deep dives. So I thank you all for sort of participating. If there's any follow-up, I guess you could reach out to Dave or Michael or myself on LinkedIn, as well as Foresight. And I'm just going to hand it over here for Tyler to wrap it up for sort of the summary and sort of maybe some housekeeping items, if there's how to get the copy of the link and what have you. But a really big thanks to Dave and Michael for spending the time here. They have enormous experience. So we're grateful that they were here to sort of provide some insights. And Tyler, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to echo your sentiment. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I think it was a really insightful conversation. We covered a lot, and I think there's some really awesome participation. Just quickly, as we wrap things up, I did drop a couple of links in the chat. Please take a minute to provide some feedback. It really helps us build out these fireside chats and address topics that are relevant to you and whatnot. Also, BC Clean Tech Awards are still open for nominations are still open. There's a link there. If you're interested, please take a look at that. And yeah, thank you to everyone. This was a great conversation, and looking forward to seeing you next time for another fireside chat. So thanks everyone, and talk to you soon.